my book, chapters of my book, but I think I've read most of them. So now I'm being forced to go back into my archives here. And this is a story I wrote many years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And I had actually once brought it to a writing workshop that I took, and it felt so unsupported and strange that afterwards I put it away and didn't look at it again for years and years and years. And I've been thinking about it, this story, and I really like it. And I thought, I pulled it up and I started tweaking it, and now, you know, I feel like I do want to read it. It's kind of creative nonfiction in that it's a story about my parents in 1967 when I was 11. And I don't really know the depth of their emotions, so I'm sort of creating something. But, you know, it's a lot of this did happen. And I also threw in a little magic realism. So indulge me is, you know, was fun to do. I'll be interested in the response. So this is called, and I don't even know if this is working. Yeah, I guess it's working. Okay. So this is called Don Reuter. You know what that means? It's Yiddish for your redhead. Oh, I forgot. I have to do something. Sorry.
I'm going to turn your volume up a tiny bit.
Well, yeah, there. Hello? Yeah, that's better. There's something I have to do here. Sorry. This is authentic. I have to make this authentic. Are you bringing your parents into the room?
I thought you were going to do.
No. Hopefully my piece will invoke them, yes. Sylvia burrowed deeper into the bottom of the bed. Pillows and blankets patted her on all sides, blocking out the world. Finally, Abe's persistence disarmed her. Emerging from her padded fortress, she lifted the receiver. "Get down here. I need you. No one showed up today. I'm going nuts down here. I need help." Abe's tone was familiar. Anxious, angry, desperate. She grunted, replacing the black barbell onto the telephone's cradle. It had been hard enough wrenching the kids from their beds at 6 this morning. Then, of course, driving them to school at the last minute anyway. She faced the stern looks of all those teachers with their tight suits and straight backs. In the schoolyard, buzzers were going off, Miles was crying, and her untamed body, beneath car-coated nightgown, flapped in the wind. All she could think to say to Miles' teacher was, "He made it. He's on time. See, he's a good boy. He'll adjust." Her eyes pleaded with the teacher as he stepped into line at 8:45, the last bell. Only then could she escape back to her warm bed, until jarred out of the deep dream of peace by this familiar death knell from Abe. At 10 a.m., she breathed deep, stepped in and out of the shower, and stuffed her flabby self into a brassiere and girdle. She connected the support hose to the hanging garters, cognizant of how heavy her legs were. Her 80s hot dog's uniform stood waiting, ironed and starched. Although freshly laundered, she still smelled the sauerkraut. Once dressed, she brushed her red hair back, applied orange lipstick, dabbed Secret of Venus behind her ears, clipped on some earrings, and smiled into the mirror. "I should call Mom to check in." On the tail of that thought came the memory of Mom's final heart attack and funeral last month. She grabbed her keys, slammed the front door, started the car, and Radio 950 love songs. "If I were a carpenter and you were a lady," she sang as she drove towards South Philadelphia. The luncheonette was hopping with lunchtime trade. Poor Abe served 8 people at once with a smile. Some paid, some he never got back to. She realized this as she entered. Is it any wonder they come from all over town at lunchtime? Sylvia shook her head. She grabbed an apron, reached for her smile, and handled the next 5 orders. By 2:30, the place had thinned out. They shared a combination, a fish cake wrapped around a hot dog in a bun, smothered with mustard, sauerkraut, and Abe's homemade pepper hash. They were commenting on the freshness of the roll when Alan the bread man stopped by. Abe, I think I saw your Sheldon today, panhandling with the hippies on Rittenhouse Square. Was it? Alan whispered, embarrassed, and yet as a parent and friend, he wanted to mention it. Abe responded in a similar tone. Sheldon moved out of the house, grew his hair long, and dropped out in his freshman year of college at Temple. We were so excited when he got accepted last year. He says he wants to make it on his own. Alan nodded. My daughter's away at Penn State. Not happy, he shrugged, wondering how long she would last. After Alan's visit, Sylvia and Abe decided between them that Abe would drop a case of hot dogs off at Sheldon's new apartment on his way home tonight. All day in the back of her mind, Sylvia saw her son Sheldon begging on the street. Disgraceful. What was he thinking? Is this what comes after all those loving handmade birthday gifts? His Mother's Day cooking attempts and years of perfect report cards? Is this what he calls making it on his own? She couldn't wait to get home to her 3 younger kids, to feel their excitement greeting her at the door, or at least when they remembered to look up from the TV. At 4, when Abe's after-school help arrived, she drove home. She was glad she remembered to bring hoagies for dinner. They would just sit down and eat together without her usual anxiety about what to cook. That part of being a housewife is not for me, she thought. Even the word housewife is a joke these days. Hadn't Betty, what's her name? Betty Friedan, written a book about this? I must get back to my discussion group. She straightened her back and turned the corner to Eastwood Street. She felt better as she pulled in front of the house. Tracy and Miles, her 2 youngest, were rocking on patio chairs with the boys from next door. Lance is probably in the basement with his chemistry set, she thought. I wonder how that volcano is coming along. A prize in the science fair would be so good for him. I wonder if those teachers realize how bright he is. The smell of sulfur invaded her nose, cutting into her throat as she entered the front door, while children pulled at her packages. The smell could mean only one thing. Lance's volcano had erupted too soon. That wasn't supposed to happen until the science fair demonstration. She ran downstairs to measure the damage. Back at the store, Rodney was helping Abe, as he did every day after high school. Rodney lived nearby in the South Fork housing projects with his grandmother. He was happy to have a job. Abe was glad to find a responsible person. He'd been through too many all-talk, no-action employees. But today, Rodney was sneezing all over the place. Abe filled Rodney's pockets with vitamin C tablets. Just this morning in the bathroom at home, the only place he ever got around to reading and thinking, he'd read about Linus Pauling, the chemist advocating vitamin C as the best antidote to the common cold. But when he looked up from his magazine, he thought he saw his mother in the bathroom mirror, shaking her head. He blinked, dismissing the image. Take one every hour until you feel better, Abe reminded Rodney after every series of sneezes. They closed the store by 10. Both men went their separate ways. Rodney walked south on 4th Street towards home. Abe remembered Sheldon's case of hot dogs and a quart of each of orange juice and milk for the kids' breakfast. He drove west on Monroe Street towards Rittenhouse Square. An orange lay in the passenger side seat of his 1965 Ford Galaxy. It bounced as he revved the engine and shifted into drive. No use wasting good food, he thought, and bit into the tough skin to get it started. He spit the peel out the window as he turned north on 5th, west on Lombard, north on 18th. Learn to forget. Learn to forget. A deep masculine voice boomed from the windows of the apartment. It seemed to resemble music, but not like anything Abe had ever listened to. At least you can understand the lyrics on this one, he thought. I guess the kids are having a party. He entered the vibrating building and was struck by the dirt and stench. He thought of the tenements he and his mother had to live in after his father died. This was much worse. He felt dizzy and exhausted, lumbering up 3 flights of steps with a case of hot dogs and 6 bags of rolls. Inhaling the sweet air pervading the building brought him back to some of the roughhouses he fought in during his boxing career. He heard someone yell from the top of the steps. "Oh, wow, some old gray-haired guy's coming up the steps. Heads up!" Abe entered the open door of the smoky apartment. He looked around and found Sheldon sprawled naked on the bathroom floor. He seemed to be coated in something green. Sheldon was waving his hands in the air, staring past them. Then he placed his ear to the tiles, as if he were listening. The bathtub was full of Jell-O. A young woman was basking in it. "Sheldon! Sheldon, wake up! What the hell's wrong with you?" Abe scanned the room, outraged by the apparent lack of concern. His attention shifted back to Sheldon. He tried not to notice or react to the naked young girl in the bathtub. Feeling embarrassed and out of place, he said, "Sheldon, here, feed your friends." Abe left the hot dogs on the bathroom floor and ran from the apartment. Once the outside air penetrated his foggy brain, he thought of his mother. She at least would have scrubbed these steps. His mother looked up from the bottom step, brushing back hair from her face with the back of her hand in a scrub brush. Her pained expression was almost more than he could bear. "I'm dropping out of school, Mom. I don't need to finish. This country's in a depression. I need to find work." Abe explained to his mother, but she wasn't buying it. He didn't tell her that he planned to fight for a living. He'd just been matched with another local featherweight to box at the Blue Horizon Club on North Broad Street. The promoter promised him several fights a week at $25 a fight, more than grown men with families were making. "Short nick, Mom. Don't worry. I'll finish up later, Mom." He promised. She shook her head. He never did go back. At least not in her lifetime. He blinked her away. A chill ran through him. His eyes were moist. He took refuge in his car. Although it was late September, he turned on the heat. Abe's car headed north from Rittenhouse Square until it reached the Ben Franklin Parkway. Here it veered west towards the Philadelphia Museum of Art rather than his usual route east and up Delaware Avenue. Abe soon found himself on Logan Circle looking towards the art museum. He remembered their first kiss at the Waterworks Park, just down the road. He remembered the strength of Sylvia's embrace, her firm, muscular frame, and how the light kissed her hair. He knew from that first kiss, she was the girl with whom he would spend his life. How free and lightheaded he had felt. He remembered how he couldn't wait to tell his mother and sisters. So much water under the bridge since 1947. 20 years since that first kiss, and since they'd been to the museum together. Every time a car overtook him, the faces of their 4 children lit up. There were pictures of them hanging from the rearview mirror. His eldest son, Sheldon, was now a stranger to him, with eyes that traveled to places his father dared not go. The other 3 would be in bed as usual when he arrived home. But at least they had warm beds in a good neighborhood with great schools. Would they too drop out of college to take drugs and swim in tubs of Jell-O? He clutched the wheel in the darkness. For a second, he thought he saw his mother again, but realized it was the photograph of his daughter, struck by the light of a passing car. He cried, sunk his face into his arms at every red light, but held tight to the wheel. Abe entered the dark house at midnight. What is that smell? He thought. Lance must be brewing something in the basement again. Now he's going to college. Abe placed a quart of milk and a quart of orange juice into the refrigerator for the kids in the morning. He dragged himself up the stairs to the second floor, crawled into bed next to a mound of impenetrable blankets, and toppled into a dreamless sleep. As the sun arose, so did he, to sleepwalk through another day. Abe called Sylvia at noon to say hi, and cringed as he asked her if she could come down today around 4. He knew it was unexpected, but Rodney was too sick and tired to come in. It turned out as Rodney walked home last night, the police stopped him, because to them, a black teenager on the streets after 10 was a suspicious character. They found the vitamins in his pockets and held him in custody until the lab confirmed that they were in fact vitamins. He was released at 5 this morning, at which point he was running a high temperature and couldn't go to school. Abe told Rodney to stay home and get better. Then Abe called Sylvia. At 3 in the afternoon, she left $5 and a note to her 3 self-sufficient kids on their own a lot now since Sheldon moved out. Dear Lancela, Tracela, and Misela. She used Yiddish pet names. Order pizza for dinner. Take milk. Tip the driver. Love, Mother. She stepped into an unironed uniform, applied fresh lipstick, and left the door unlocked but shut. Radio 950 love songs vibrated through the car as Sylvia turned the key. The car smelled like sauerkraut. She snapped off the sound, hungering for silence, but her thoughts wouldn't subside. They were gathering strength like sulfur underground. Trapped. I'm trapped. I hate that place. I hate him for depending on me. I hate that I'm so dependable. She broke into a sweat, her scalp itched. She quickly scratched with both hands and wondered when she'd have time for a touch-up. She took the long way into town. Soon she was on Logan Circle, approaching the Rodin Museum. She stopped the car to admire the light on the thinker. She cried, sinking her face into her arms, but held tight to the wheel. In the distance, the art museum loomed out of focus. She reached for a tissue, noticed the time, and drove on. Duty called. At 4, Abe emerged from the basement of the store with diced potatoes for the fryer. Sylvia stood, face to the grill and the window that opened to customers on the street. He noticed her hair first, how the evening light was creating highlights from amber to auburn, the colors of an autumn harvest. It struck him how much he loved, no, adored this Rubenesque woman, his wife of 20 years. He approached her from the back, applied wet kisses to her neck and shoulders. He inhaled and began to sing. If I were a carpenter and you were a lady. Her body relaxed into his as they faced the grill and the light of the setting sun. Mom and Dad.
He was the first stem cell transplant for ALD in the world at Duke University Children's Hospital. So I worked for this family, helped them build a website, answered lots of questions about the ALD Foundation that they started, and while working there, met a young man in New Orleans who had adult onset of the same disease. It's called ALS, and he's blind. He's pretty functional. He works with this foundation. He helps over 100 people in many different countries around the world whose families have kids with ALD. Through the foundation, he met a woman who was struggling to help her son. 6 weeks later, he proposed to this woman, and she said yes. And together they are raising their stepson. He's raising his stepson, who has ALD. And they had another child together. I just can't imagine having the courage to have another kid. They did in vitro fertilization to ensure that they could screen for the ALD gene. So as they struggle with grace and humor and love to help their older stepson with ALD, he's writing this book, and this is the first chapter, and it's called With This Ring. Our son is dying. He's not going to live. The day we learned this, he was only 12 years old. In the minds of some, our news came as no surprise. Logan was born with the predisposition to develop a genetically determined neurological disorder at some point in his life. The chances of development are 100%. However, this did little to ease the ensuing burden that gripped us. Each and every year, he had been tested to see if the disease was active. Each and every year, that is, until his 10th birthday, we've been told, relax. By then, kids who are likely to develop the childhood form of this disorder, which is fatal, are considered to be out of the woods. We had moved on from this dread of our son's imminent death to apprehension of the adult prickling form, which I have. We had done what most parents would do. Rather than scheduling an annual brain MRI, we opted to put it off for 6 or 8 months. You see, for us, this had seemed reasonable advice. For the past decade, I've been the chief executive of an international medical foundation that assists families and works with physicians dedicated to providing a remedy for this rare genetic disorder. I've worked with doctors at some of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning on the planet, and when a trusted doctor mentioned over dinner 2 years before Logan's diagnosis that Logan was likely out of the woods, or certainly out of the darkest part, it was difficult to accept. It was difficult not to accept his words as gospel. Then Jamie called me to deliver the news that our trusted doctor had been wrong. She was with Logan at Children's Hospital in New Orleans. I was in my office at home, our 2-year-old Brennan on my lap. We were studying phonics on my computer when the phone rang. The news hit me hard. Jamie continued to speak, explaining what the doctors had told her, and all I could do was look at our baby. This little boy should not be raised an only child. That was not part of our plan. The remainder of what I heard from Jamie amounted to no more than blah, blah, blah. I heard nothing, only that our nightmare had begun. Shortly after hanging up with her and getting the little one focused on something that would sustain his attention for a minute, I picked up the phone and started dialing while simultaneously emailing Logan's brain MRI to physicians around the world. The first physician I spoke with was Patrick Aubourg in Paris. When he answered, he was already viewing the images I sent. David, I'm so sorry. There was a tone in his voice I'd never heard before. Thank you, Patrick. So are you available day after tomorrow? I got right to the point of my call. What? You're coming here, he asked, more shocked than surprised. Yes, you have stopped ALD in 5 boys now. From the look of things, we can't wait. Logan and I can be on a plane to Paris in the morning. If need be, we'll stay there a few weeks so he can be treated. Patrick's groundbreaking strides had created international news a few years earlier. David, I cannot do this. I don't have any vector. Therefore, I could not put the genetically corrected cells back into Logan's body. As he spoke, he began to weep. The vector he was referring to was the delivery device to put cells back in the body. Patrick, are you crying? The sound of surprise in my voice was obvious. David, I'm surrounded by this disease daily. I have seen patients with ALD my entire career, but have never, ever dealt with the child of a friend. His words were soothing to me. This is a terrible situation for you and Jamie, even more so for Logan. I'm so sorry, David, I truly am. Patrick, I appreciate your sentiments fully. Do his films look good enough that bone marrow transplant would be possible at Minnesota? Not knowing that gene therapy was out of the question, I was moving on. His score is a 13. While it's more realistic for a child with a score of 7 or 8 to do well during transplant, it's still a possibility. The one thing I would caution you about is that if he's eligible, you must have a 10 out of 10 match for cells. The cells must match perfectly. He delivered his last words with emphasis. I knew he was advising me in the best possible way. Paul, my next call was to Dr. Paul Orchard, transplant extraordinaire when it comes to ALD. David, how are you? He was his usual jovial self. Not well, buddy. Logan was just diagnosed. Complete silence. David, wow. Do you have any idea of his low score? The lowest reflects the true extent of the damage in a brain MRI. Patrick estimated that it's somewhere around 12. I have a disc, Paul, and can send you the images right away. I spoke with authority and uncertainty at the same time. In terms of treatment, Paul was essentially our last defense. Send him over, and I'll call you back as soon as radiology lets me know something. And he was off. The next hour or so was unnerving. Jamie and I both work at home. Me in a converted bedroom, she in a building that used to be a workshop at the end of our driveway. Every time she entered the house, I ran to her. This, despite the fact that I was the one who should have all the answers, seemed like the proper thing to do. Logan was outside, playing with some kids from the neighborhood. Brennan doing his level best at 2, not to drive him crazy. I want to play baseball, Daddy. I had recently set up a batting tee in the backyard. Even though he was only 2, he took great interest in the game. The phone rang. David, it's Paul. I let out a breath. A breath that felt as though I had been holding it for days. Paul, what's the word? He could sense my anxiety and did his best to allay my fears. David, we can try to transplant him. Hope. The only problem I see is that his low score is 13. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I knew right away it was high. We can try. You know we'll try. His friendship was obvious, and I got the same sense from Paul that I got from Pat. He cared, and it showed. Let me talk to Jamie, and I'll get back to you with what we do next. And Paul, by the way, thank you. I really mean it. It seems to me that whatever was on your calendar today has now been put aside for us, and that means a great deal, and I was doing my best to keep it together. David, it's my pleasure. You know, let me know if you guys want to come up and have him evaluated. Will do. After hanging up, I bolted out to Jamie's office. Brennan in tow. As soon as we arrived, he began to play with something on a bookshelf, which told me that Jamie and I could speak without being interrupted for a second. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Logan running down the street and felt like the most powerless person alive. Baby, I spoke with Paul. Jamie's facial expression suddenly changed. She'd been waiting. What'd he say? What do we do? How bad is it? Her frustration was mounting. He said that things are a little bit less than ideal. He did, however, say that if we wanted to attempt a transplant, he would do his best to stop the ALD. The strain of the day had her in his grips. Later that night, I sat alone with Jamie talking about our options. I could feel the weight of Logan's diagnosis in the room. It was as though what she had been expecting all day long had come true. As we spoke, I began to notice hesitation on our part, and in my mind it was simple. We fly to Minneapolis, we have Logan evaluated, we fly home, we make a decision. In her opinion, it just wasn't that simple. If we travel there for treatment, we have to recognize some critical things. First of all, we don't know anyone in Minnesota. I know Paul real well, I said with a quick response. David, he would be Logan's doctor. I doubt he has the time or the ability to give us the support we need. My point is that we have none of that there. Her body language suggested that she had given this considerable thought. Honey, most families stay at the Ronald McDonald House. There are counselors on staff. I'm not as much worried about support as I'm about results. The chief executive in me was taking over. Before I started citing incidents and statistics, I leaned in, gave Jamie a quick kiss, and rested my head on her chest. She took this to mean, for now, we're done talking. The following morning, after dropping Logan off at camp, I busied myself with making arrangements. I opened a web browser to airline information and began looking for the best flights to Minneapolis. Just before I purchased the tickets, my phone rang, and it was Jamie. David, I need information. Jamie's serious side was in full effect. My wife is a buyer for a chemical company. Whenever working, she's the most detail-oriented, meticulous human being alive. I could hear from her tone that this is exactly the mode she was in. What kind of information are you referring to? Her words made me curious. The previous day, I'd filled her in the best possible way. I want to know how many boys with the same amount of damage Logan has have been transplanted in the past decade. I also need to know what the success rates have been for all of them. In my opinion, these are the most important things we can know. I immediately called Paul, asked him to be in touch with Jamie. He understood her desire and indicated that she would have what she wanted in minutes. Brennan entered my office with a desire to play, and just after loading the DVD, the phone rang. Don't buy the tickets. There's no point. Jamie's mood was difficult to judge. The serious tone was gone, and what replaced it was just unrecognizable. Over 80% of boys with a similar amount of damage have died from transplant-related complications. In light of the fact that his prognosis was terrible, this came as no surprise. We're not going. In my estimation, we could leave here a family of 4 to return a few months later a family of 3. I understand ALD, David. I watched my father slowly pass, and it was less than ideal. However, I've listened to you for the past 5 years and feel we must do what you recommend to every family. She sounded resolute. My anticipation grew. You tell everyone that regardless of the course they choose to pursue, they must put their children's quality of life first. This is what I want us to do. We love him, so let's show him. Let's go to bed every night with no doubt just how much. This is what I want, and I hope you will support me. If I could have looked at her through the telephone, I would detect a tear running down her cheek as she spoke. Jamie, as much as I hope that he'd have a chance, if this is what he needs, then this is what I'll have. I'm sorry, baby. I'm just so sorry that things are going this way. Between your dad, uncle, and cousins, you've experienced too much with this disease. I'm sorry they didn't realize it sooner. I'm still stunned. I love you, Jamie, and I promise to do my best to give you what you need. I'll speak with you a little bit later. And I hung up, and I really didn't know what else to say. When Logan returned from camp that afternoon, I simply sat and I just watched him. I observed every move, every motion, and my mind raced with wonder. I suppose that my intimate knowledge of ALD made me look for things that were not there yet. The night before bed, I eased my way into his room, and I just looked at him. As he slept, my mind wandered days, even months forward. I became choked up for a moment before turning away and returning to my bedroom. And once in bed, I let out a tremendous sigh. Our sweet, innocent little boy had absolutely no idea what the next day would bring and what would happen next. Pardon? He does want feedback, and I'd be happy to share a link with Tracy that can be shared with the group. What's interesting is that I've read lots of things from my friend David, where he brings a lot more of his kind of come sit on my porch Southern style into his writing. And this chapter's really straight, like a news article. And his next 2 chapters are filled with funny moments and poignant moments at home. It's like once they decided to keep him at home and not get treatment, kind of like, it reminded me of Tracy's book in a little way. They could get into the stories of their lives, but in his opening, he wrote it like so straight that it's like different from the rest of his chapters. So I actually think he'd appreciate the feedback, and I wish you could see this. He has like such a vibrant personality and such a tender heart, and it doesn't get into this chapter as much as when you're talking to him one-on-one. So yeah, he would welcome any and all feedback, and also just the more people know about the foundation and his family and his desire to have the book published for his son, like the better. So when I didn't have something to read myself tonight, I thought I'd introduce you all to David Crod. He's a remarkable person who can save so many children's lives and like can't save his own. And this book is keeping him going. Really, literally, writing this book is keeping him going from day to day. So
was gonna say, as a first chapter, it does make you want to stay.
And find out what happens. Yeah.
So you said he's blind?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that too, and it's like he's talking so vividly as if he's seeing everybody.
I don't know if he's 100% blind. I think he's like reached the legal blind, whatever the legally blind threshold is. Yeah, and he has trouble walking. I mean, he's not declining anymore, whatever impasse he's reached. Like he's lived with as an adult, so his coping skills have kicked in and he's stable. But it's like there's a gene that's passed through the mother, and so many people in a family, until you recognize it, like you don't even know until so many kids are born. Like in the family through cousins and that goes. It's deep stuff. But thank you for listening. I appreciate it very much.
And I just wanted to say again on the mic that Casey just had this book published, and she's not reading from it, she's reading something else, but it's very exciting. And she read from this at the last time she came to open mic, and now it's a book. So it's great, and they're for sale too. So, you know, and I remember, I mean, you know, it's a great narrative. So yeah, pass it around. Casey.
So this is a modern narrative. It's fiction, and it's not historical, but it is going back to a young woman's life when she was younger. So I'm still very much in the very early stages. I did an outline for it in the summer, and it's not really the novel I'll necessarily be working on right now, but I just wanted to hear how it sounds because I haven't done that yet. It's called Just Wait right now. That's the working title. Part 1. No title for that. During the last week of 5th grade, Sophia felt the girl staring at her from the back of the room for the 1000th time since... I'm sorry, let me start again. During the last week of 5th grade, Sophia felt the girl staring at her from the back of the room for the 1000th time since 1st grade. And as she always did, Sophia turned around to face her. And, as always when their eyes met, a beady-eyed Diane would mouth the words, "Just wait." What next, Sophia invariably thought, the dread creeping under her skin and sending its hair straight up. What's she going to do to me before I leave today? It didn't take long to find out. On this particular day, as soon as Sophia walked out of the double doors of the elementary school that housed 400 children from kindergarten to 6th grade, she felt a warm, heavy goo hit her neck and slide down her back under her dress. She turned around in time to see the girl, Diane, shooting off into the park, in the opposite direction to the one Sophia would take to get home. She glanced around at the other kids in the schoolyard, some fanning into the park toward their own homes, some standing in small groups, a few smirking at her, and she knew she'd need to grow up soon to be able to get away from that horrible Diane and anyone like her. It wasn't just mud slopped on Sophia's dress. At Diane's hand, she'd suffered jeering and tripping, signs taped to her shirt, missing erasers from her desk, gum on her seat, all between 1st and 5th grade. And each time Sophia would look for Diane, the girl would be careening away from her crimes, never standing there to take the joy in her evil deeds. As the years passed, despite the dread Diane evoked in her, Sophia had little enough respect for her cruelty and even less for her cowardice, as she saw it. If she were a bully, she'd want to see her victim's reaction. The boys she knew who tugged the pants down of weaker, unsuspecting boys made it a point to stand there, to point and laugh, and revel in their nastiness. It added something to their cruelty, Sophia understood. Diane's brand of it lacked that ingredient. Still, it was only a matter of time before Sophia's humiliation at the girl's dull-edged pranks would be rewarded, and Sophia would be the one to dole it out to her. She'd had enough. One day, on the first day of 6th grade, a year that found Sophia uniquely positioned behind Diane in a seating plan that made her love the homeroom teacher everyone else loathed for his bad breath and constant throat clearing, Sophia watched Diane's head 2 rows ahead of her. That head, thick with woolly black curls, with nowhere to go but out and up. She noticed how it seemed to twitch lightly, as if she were trying not to look left or right. Her shoulders rose a little, then settled and grew rigid. Waiting, observing, Sophia held her breath and let it go. The teacher was clearing his throat and bending near a student to check his schedule, murmuring at close range something about going to the classroom down the hall. Sophia noticed this boy was turned away slightly, grimacing, his eyes close enough to where she sat for her to see his misery and the downdraft of the teacher's rancid breath. She smiled at him, at how trapped he was. She knew that feeling in her way. She turned her gaze back to Diane. It had been less than a half minute, and Diane was beginning to shift in her seat, to swivel her head slowly to one side, then her body with it, her shoulders, her stomach, one arm, clutching the back of the chair. Sophia braced herself as Diane's narrowed blue eyes found her. And before that bully could open her mouth, Sophia formed the voiceless words, "Just wait." She hadn't planned to say anything, but she knew she had a different advantage with that view of the girl. Diane frowned, puzzled at first, and clearly irritated. At recess, she kept her distance. In fact, all that first week and well into the next, the bully didn't come near Sophia, who had grown wary of the girl's lack of attention. She was prepared for anything. And she was rewarded, or so she knew fundamentally that's what it was, the moment when Diane approached Sophia, just as school let out one day in the middle of the following week, and grinned at her. It was confusing, that grin, and Sophia let one side of her mouth respond in kind. Just as the rest of her mouth grew willing, Diane's hand came up from her side and she placed a large handful of mud on Sophia's dress. Sophia was fast this time. She pretended to stumble and fell right on top of Diane, scraping her knee in the tumble and not feeling the sting. "Wow, sorry," she said, getting up. "I meant to go around you, but you were just standing there. And why don't you run?" Mute, Diane stared down at her shirt front and looked up at Sophia. "You're always running away after you do something mean to me. Why not this time?" Her voice was nothing more than matter-of-fact, even curious, since she was that. Diane's eyes filled, and she put her hand on Sophia's mud-soaked stomach, gathered some of the soiled dress in her fingers with a surprising gentleness, and whispered a faint, "Sorry," before she did, in fact, turn and run for home. For the rest of 6th grade, Sophia kept Diane in the corner of her eye if she wasn't sitting in front of her in homeroom or another class. Diane kept her distance and seemed to remain alone. Being free of her meant Sophia could pursue other friendships, but she wasn't ready. She would wait until she finished elementary school, she decided, where fewer people knew her. She would be new. Long ago, Sophia had stopped complaining to her parents about all of Diane's deeds. Their refrain had always been that Diane was powerless and needed to overpower someone else. That Sophia was the stronger one, the smarter one, the kinder among her gossiping friends. "Don't worry, honey, Diane will figure it out one day. Just wait." So it was easier with each day that passed not to tell her parents about what became to Sophia historically the last day of Diane, even though she could never remember the exact date. It was enough to see the recognition in the girl's eyes. And then another section. Do I have time? A few more minutes? Often in middle school, Sophia pined for a boy who pined for another girl, always the more stylish, prettier ones. Sophia was struck early on by the idiocy of the arrangement and tried to turn her back on the boy, realizing that if he were smarter, he would realize that it's the less glamorous girls who were the more interesting, once you got to know them. That's what her mother said every time, unprompted by little more than a solemn affect she attributed to Sophia's annoyance, to Sophia being in some kind of unrequited love. Of course, her mother was right, but Sophia had no interest in tipping her hand. The truth was, Sophia had read enough books by the time she was 13 and finishing 7th grade to know what it meant to love someone and have them not return it, or worse, kick it to the curb altogether. She was young, but her taste in literature had bloomed and flourished early. Already she had read and understood some of D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love and knew she might want to read it again when she was older. She preferred the novels that made the women seem stronger than the men, even though she had yet to feel that way herself. There was something in her soul she recognized as an opening her girlfriends didn't see or have themselves, that the boys she liked didn't see either. But she couldn't articulate it or recognize it yet in the moments when she hoped it would serve her. She had, in the beginning of middle school, gone out of her way to be nice to one particular boy who decided to chase the prettier, more popular, always laughing Claire. It was easy at first because the boy, Flynn, was new to the school, like so many of the boys she liked, and didn't know anyone when he landed in her homeroom. Sophia often made it her task to be one of the friendlier faces a new student would see, but more often the new student would be drawn to the more fashionably dressed or the less shy, and in one unexpected case to the worst troublemaker in the school, which led Sophia to wonder how her own judgment had been so off as to think the new boy would have been the right kind of friend in the first place. But this boy, Flynn, was a blank slate. For weeks, he seemed to seek only Sophia's company, and though she was peripherally friendly with bouncy Claire, who was more often hanging out on Derek, the class president, Sophia let Flynn use her notes from class, and they often walked home from school together, then turned at their respective corners. Sophia would feel a tug when Flynn walked off, and she'd watch him an extra minute, then walk on herself, turning every so often to see if he'd turned to watch her go, and noticing he hadn't, that he never did. While she was pining for Flynn, Sophia began to think of herself as a character in one of the stories she was reading, and imagined she had the same longer, wavy hair, the same glossy skin and bright seawater eyes, rather than the thick, straight, rust-colored hair and olive green eyes she'd inherited from her parents. She knew, as the second month of school was coming to an end, that Claire, friendly though she could be, had all but taken her place in Flynn's life. Sophia watched the scorned Derek, the class president, walk around with his head high and a deep, angry frown, and she did her best to sew up that spot in her soul and continue to imagine herself as the literary heroine in her latest read.
I was just curious, of course I'm particularly interested because your character centers around age I teach every day. And if you wanted feedback from this age group about if they could relate to your character, I'd be happy to provide that feedback if you want it.
I like that. I'm not as far into it yet, but I mean, the first, only written half a dozen pages, very much in this same age. And it's really about how Sophia sees herself in a way that others don't see her, or how she's yet to learn to see herself is the other part of it. The Just Wait has different contexts, as I tried to introduce early, but I mean, I would like that, except that it's really about a novel about a young woman as opposed to a young adult. So I might still do it, because, I mean, what's your take on her mindset at that age?
There's so many different varieties. Kids fall all along the spectrum at this age, and some are more and less mature than others. But I see girls like this every year. Absolutely resonates. I mean, few. When you're looking at a sample group, let's say, of a typical class of 25 kids, you're talking about 2 or 3. But they're always there. That girl is always present somewhere every year.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's good to know.
I really like the entree into someone's mind.
Yeah.
Into someone's mind. I love that. I love that in books. That's why I love Margaret Atwood. I just like being in that inner dialogue. So
That's a point of view I'm still trying to work with.
Yeah.
Close third person. I like
Yeah.
that part.
yeah, it's
I think she knows herself. That she's beginning to know herself.
Yeah.
She's certain about some things and uncertain about others. And what you pick so interestingly develops the voice.
Thank you. And, Casey's book.
if you want. So James.
All right. Yeah, I've been doing some writing, I guess, for the past couple of years. Just, different kind of stories about my life and stuff. In October 2005, I called my father for the first time in 10 years. I guess I figured quite a bit had happened since the last time we talked in 1994. I had gotten married, bought a house, been through 4 or 5 cars, done a 6-year stint in the Air Force National Guard, watched the Twin Towers fall and spark 2 wars, had 3 cats, was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, and I got an answer this year. A few hours went by, and just about the time I was resigned to stop waiting for a call back, my phone began to vibrate. When I answered, I remember thinking his voice was very familiar, considering how few times I had actually spoken to him. As a kid, my pop had visitation rights pretty much any time he felt like, making the less than 30-minute drive from Camden to Southwest Philly. On the weekends, he agreed to come. I would wait on my grandmother's porch in my blue kid-sized folding chair and wait for him. More often than not, we would get a last-minute phone call. With some reason or other why he couldn't make it. My dad was a cop, and my grandmother usually would say he's out getting the bad guys. Pretty sure by second grade I had grown hard to this disappointing news. I really can't say how much time I had actually spent with my dad in my lifetime, but if I had to guess, I could ballpark it at possibly 75 times, optimistically. And if I broke that down to actual hours of holiday time, it really had a diminishing return. But I can tell you that I knew my father. I knew his personality, the subtle inflections in his voice, what made him laugh and what made him angry. I knew the endearing, old-school way he would interact with the waitresses at all the diners we used to go to. The Stiller and Mirror type relationship he had with his wife. There was absolutely no affection there, but they had a strong something holding them together. Of course, there was Michael, my brother, from a different mother that he adored, and who adored him right back. My father was smart and funny, and people seemed to love being around him. So back to the phone call. It was very short, but we agreed to meet at Ponzio's for lunch the following Sunday. I hung up the phone, and my wife, who had overheard the conversation, was delighted that I swallowed my pride and made the first move to contact the man behind the mill. That Saturday, I went out and got a haircut, and I did all the things I shouldn't have done to prepare for our Sunday meeting. Sunday at church, I remember telling anyone who would listen, I was seeing my father for the first time in 27 motherfucking years. I remember going to my friend Ed and telling him. And rather than sharing my excitement, he very cautiously told me not to expect much. His experience with his father was very similar. It took the wind out of my sails, but I knew he was speaking from the heart. Without any subsequent phone calls, my father indeed met us at the diner, along with his wife, the following Sunday. They both looked very good, especially with the amount of time that had gone by. In fact, I thought my dad looked great. He was tall and slender, not the 300-pound bruiser I remembered from my childhood. We sat in the booth and engaged in small talk for the next 2 hours or so. Nothing too heavy, only pleasantries, really. I learned he had gone from a patrol officer from my childhood to the commandant of the New Jersey Police Academy. He quipped that he was a Mason, a top-degree Mason, and very involved in the Knights of Columbus. He was also a New Jersey Park Commissioner, and he held more titles and achievements than I could list here. He obtained his master's degree in criminal justice and taught some college courses. He would only say that although he had retired from the police department, he was still very involved in much of the training that the government employees in New Jersey had to undergo. My dad was one busy motherfucker. It was all great stuff, with the exception of the heart attack my dad had suffered some years before. When it came to my turn, pretty much all I could say was that I was a graphic designer and was enrolled in an accounting course and only needed 57 more credits to graduate in an undecided major. His face said everything. He was not impressed with the path my life had taken. My brother Michael was a homicide detective and had been offered a nice job with the CIA upon his retirement in 2 years. He was also married and produced 2 beautiful grandsons who both looked quite like a very young version of my father. Pop had everybody's picture in his wallet. I didn't think it was a good idea to bring up the whole schizophrenia thing. After lunch, we sort of hugged and exchanged platitudes and said goodbye. And we agreed to meet up again sometime very soon. That was in October. I didn't hold much stock in those promises, and the weeks and months had passed by, and my thoughts of my dad went dormant again, maybe to resurface in another 10 years. But hold on. Sometime in July, my wife got a phone call one Saturday morning from my father's wife. I guess it went something to the effect of, my father had another heart attack, and I should get over to Jersey if I wanted to see him again. My wife and I climbed into the tours and headed to the hospital in beautiful downtown Camden. We went to the waiting room to look for Rose, my father's wife, and out of nowhere, a guy approached us and introduced himself as Michael, my brother. I can tell you without any exaggeration, the last time I saw this guy, he was 13 and pudgy and wearing a Fonzie t-shirt. And I couldn't have picked him out of the lineup. We shook hands and he was very cordial and really appeared excited to see us. We then met his wife Dawn and their 2 kids, and that also seemed, and they also seemed excited to meet us. Of course, Rosie was there, and we all went up to see my dad. Walking into the intensive care unit was very unsettling to me. My dad was a giant, probably 6'2", and carried himself like he owned the joint everywhere he went. It was horrible seeing him lying there, unconscious, unshaven, with his teeth on the nightstand. As a very young child, I remember some funny things my dad used to do. I may have been 6 or 7 when riding in the front seat of my dad's car, when he very proudly removed his teeth and held them up in the air. I remember thinking, that was really cool, and I wanted to be able to take my teeth out too. Looking back now, I think, wow, my dad lost all his teeth before he was 25. My dad was floating in and out of consciousness, and I patted myself on the back for making the decision to make the trip. I didn't know it at the time, but I would spend the better half of the next 2 weeks driving back and forth to the hospital and then to the rehabilitation facility. Spending most of that time in a waiting room area, getting to know my brother and his family. And my heart began to cheer my father on with the hopes that we all might bask in each other's warmth. Over the next 2 years, I saw more of my father than I had my entire life. We went to dinner several times, but most of it was spent watching him go from one healthcare facility to another. And almost on one incident, it was just my father and I told him about my mental illness. I abbreviated it to schizophrenia, as I normally do. It didn't seem to faze him. He told me he loved me regardless. And then I dared ask him why he had been absent all my life. His eyes welled up with crocodile tears. And he said he wanted all of me and couldn't bear to take me home on the weekends, after the weekends. Almost immediately after this bearing of this whole conversation, Rosie, his wife, stepped into the room, and he asked her to concur with his rationale, and asked her to remind me of the many tears he cried over me. And then, very matter-of-factly, told her of my mental condition. I really didn't appreciate him sharing that at this point, but no matter. I didn't buy the excuse in my heart. but it's the best he had to offer. I've come to the conclusion that there was nothing in this universe that he could have said that would have satisfied my curiosity. My father died one summer afternoon. I don't even remember the month or the year for that matter. He was surrounded by the people that loved him, including me. There was a big wake and a funeral and lots of eulogies from people that I don't know. I like to take the tough road and tell people I never shed a tear over his loss. I like to think I don't care, and my life was just fine without him. But the cold truth is, I do care. I feel like he should have been around to make my life better. I care that my father is dead, and it didn't make fuck all difference in my life. I care that I don't care.
Thank you.
Have you written more? I mean, are you making this a longer work?
Yeah, it's about
Yeah.
180 pages in. Thank you.
Yeah, you should. Very natural style.